for. So welcome to all of you. This is the second of 4 talks in the Speaking About History lecture series that the African American Archives in Columbia County is offering. This talk is Were Slaves Living in Your Cellar with Walter Wheeler. And this event is a collaboration of the African American Archive of Columbia County and the library. I'm Brenda Schufelt. I'm the program history room coordinator. Sorry, that was my former job of the library. And this event is in person, and it's also being streamed live on YouTube. There will be a recording available also on YouTube, on our channel and on the archive channel. So feel free to share this event, which is going to be great, with friends and family. And before I introduce Lisa from the archive, I just want to say a couple words about the organization of which I am a board member. The African American Archive of Columbia County began about 5 years ago with Vicki Jimson Flood, Lee Flood Smith, and Peter Smith. And I'm going to quote a little bit from their description on their website, and please do visit their website. It's fantastic. The inspiration for the archive came after several years of research into family genealogy. While they knew their own ancestors were from the Kinderhook area, they were surprised to discover how deeply interwoven Black families were with local history. There were many Black families like their own that carried the same surnames as the original Dutch settlers of the Hudson Valley. Further historical and genealogical research led them to discover a profound history of Africans and their descendants in Columbia County going back to the 17th century. Being acutely aware that this narrative has essentially been hidden from public view for centuries, they undertook to create a virtual and physical archive of data that would be available for descendants, researchers, and historians. And they really focus on those 3 groups, which is kind of everybody, if you think about it. But they are also very focused on the descendants, which is important. So they are affiliated with the Columbia County Historical Society, and they work very closely with the National Park Service, the Martin Van Buren site, and also the Jan van Hosen Charles Marriott House Historic Site, the Hudson Area Library, and the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State, which is located in Albany, as well as other groups. So when we met last October in the last Speaking About History series, I said that this organization punches above their weight. And if just hearing this description, I think you all have a feeling about that. For this particular program, as last October, all the proceeds that you donate, and there's a donation jar on the table where the sign-in is, and there's also a donation bin in the hallway just outside the door. All proceeds will go directly to the archive. I will introduce Lisa Flood Smith now. She's co-founder and deputy executive director of the African American Archive of Columbia County. She is a lay historian and researcher whose focus is on enslavement and freedom in Columbia County from the 17th to the 19th centuries, using a combination of genealogical study, historical data, and social and cultural observations. She works to build a more informed vision of the Black experience in the Hudson Valley. She is herself a direct descendant of a long line of Kinderhook area residents, going as far back as her ancestors who were enslaved there in the 1700s. Passionate about that genealogy, she loves to help connect with other descendants with she helps to connect other descendants with their ancestry. She holds a BA in Communications and Media Study from the New School for Social Research, is the owner of a furniture restoration business, and is currently writing a book on Black history in Columbia County. Lisa?
Thank you. I feel like that makes me sound so much bigger than what I am, but thank you. And thank you all for being here. This is, I think, possibly one of the best attended lectures that we've had, so I'm very excited that you're all here. And shout out to all of you who are watching the live stream. There are a lot of people there as well. I need to thank Brenda and the library for always being so supportive of us and working with us to bring these programs to you. This is really our passion, is being able to bring history that everyone else is not talking about to this area. There's so much that happened and that continues to happen in Columbia County, and it's important. And so we really care a lot about bringing that information to you. So thank you for all being here. Please take a moment, if you haven't yet, to silence your cell phones. And I will introduce Walter, our speaker. So Walter Wheeler is Senior Architectural Historian at Hartjan Archaeological Associates, where he has worked since 1999 on projects throughout the Northeast for both private and institutional clients. Previously, he worked for the Office of the State Architect and then was in private practice as a restoration architect and as an adjunct professor at SUNY New Paltz, as project director of the Hudson Valley Study Center, and at Hamilton College. He has given many public presentations and has authored approximately 100 scholarly articles and 3 monographs on New York State architecture. Wally is president of the Turpin Bannister chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians and is a founding member and officer of the Hudson Mohawk Vernacular Architecture and edits their newsletter. He has sat on the Albany County Historical Association's board since 2004 and is on the advisory board for the African American Archive of Columbia County. He knows everything. And he recently completed an 11-year term as chair of Troy's Historic Review Commission. So, without further ado, Wally, thank you.
Hey. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who came out today and people who are watching online. Before I get started, I'll just introduce this paper by saying this is a chapter in a book that I'm committed to write for SUNY Press. It's kind of a reduced version of that chapter. There are a lot more technical bits of information, graphs and grids and all that kind of thing. So there's will be a lot more when it reaches publication. So I'll just get started. Although an important avenue of research in the study of American vernacular architecture of the South, little critical work has heretofore been conducted regarding the housing of enslaved people in New York State and its physical documentation. This despite the publication of a significant body of literature during the past 20 years on the lived experience of enslaved New Yorkers. The work of archaeologists is somewhat more advanced in this respect, and through their efforts, we can begin to identify material culture associated with enslaved people in New York. Close examination of artifact assemblages and standing structures begins to suggest elements of the spiritual life of enslaved people in New York as well, a subject that has been explored in a small number of scholarly papers. Now, because this is a portion of this chapter, I won't be getting into the archaeological components or the subject of intentional depositions and apotropaic magic, which is another paper that I do present on the subject. New York's history as a melting pot appears to have had minimal impact on the specifics of how the enslaved were housed. A more compelling influence is found in the economics of the region, including the types of agriculture engaged in, land use patterns, and the manorial system of land ownership. As the regional vernacular developed to reflect these influences, increasingly sophisticated house forms provided visual and spatial separation between the households of slaveholders and those of their enslaved household servants. This paper examines the articulation of these spatial relationships as exemplified by 4 housing typologies found in New York State: the basement kitchen, the kitchen wing, the summer kitchen, and the quote-unquote Negro house. In a cautionary note, frequently encountered features on the older houses of our region are often misidentified as evidence of enslavement. Among these are rooms and basements that are secured with lockable doors, like we see here, and iron or wood window grills in basements. The former served as storage areas, typically for wine, beer, and food, and the latter, these grills, are served to allow for the passage of air into cellars without permitting the entrance of large mammals or thieves. So little was written on the practical considerations of enslaving people in the North at the time, we have little to go on when attempting to discover the spaces that these people dwelled in. The chief sources for information are advertisements for real estate, contracts for the construction of houses, and 19th century written and oral histories. A second difficulty one encounters is the almost total loss of these spaces and structures. Many have been either remodeled or removed, in many cases just after the end of slavery. As attitudes toward enslavement changed, many former owners of enslaved people chose to remove all evidence of their having participated in that unhappy institution. The Bowen House in Flushing, Queens County, received a new kitchen wing about 1795, and you can see it here. Contemporary with the emancipation of their enslaved servants. Scanned evidence, and here's that's the kitchen wing too at the other end of the house, showing it. Scant evidence for the former living quarters of the servants was permitted to remain in the house. In some cases, formerly enslaved individuals, and here actually I can, before I go any further, at the Bowen House there is only one indication, and it's a I don't even know if it's actually associated, in fact, with the occupation of this room on a second floor by enslaved people, or if it, that's the oral history. It would be unusual if true, I will say that. And it's in a room that might have originally served as a granary. And so, in fact, it might be more akin to one of those spaces that are more typically in the basement. In some cases, formerly enslaved individuals continued to work for the same family after manumission. This was the case with the Bowen family, and a different standard of living was clearly expected with a change in relationship. In the Bowen House, for example, the second floor chamber of the kitchen wing, likely the site of the servants' living quarters, has a fireplace. In a different scenario, at the Van Allen House in DeFreeseville, Rensselaer County, at least 2 enslaved people continued to work for the family after manumission in about 1815 without apparent changes to the spatial arrangement of the house. This is possibly because the number of servants was greatly reduced at that time, and they would have been able to have been accommodated in a room on the second floor of the house formerly used by some of the enslaved servants. A substantial wing was constructed in about 1835. You see it here. Oops. Oh. It died. Well, it's the shorter part of the building. Let's see. For use by German immigrant servants, it connects to the basement kitchen via a separate staircase after the last of the formerly enslaved servants left the farm, and is perhaps an indication of resistance to change on the part of the Van Allen family. Information from better documented dwellings occupied by the enslaved in the South is useful to provide missing details, but must be used with caution, as the social context in the North was not entirely analogous. With scant physical evidence remaining, written documentation takes on a primary role in the following survey. Using newspaper advertisements, building contracts, and narratives, it becomes clear that the desired segregation between enslavers and the enslaved was articulated in 4 principal ways. The examples cited here chiefly describe buildings constructed in New York. Additional examples were built in New Jersey. The first of the 4 principal ways in which enslaved people were housed in our region was the basement kitchen. One of the most common ways of articulating a social or economic separation between members of a household was the basement kitchen, or more rarely called kitchen cellars in the literature of the 18th century. The frequency with which one finds basement kitchens, particularly in the Hudson Valley, makes it clear that this spatial articulation was not limited to families who held enslaved servants, but was seen to be advantageous even when no servants were present, since it was incorporated into the design of houses of even the most modest size. An early 19th century resident of Albany indicated the reasons for the continued preference of cellar kitchens after the period of slavery had ended. Quote, "An underground room is a good place to keep Negroes in, and where, in winter, much less wood will serve for them than in an upper room. The object of an underground kitchen is to be near the cellar and to have something of the expense, to save something of the expense of fuel by putting this room partly underground, by which means it is rendered cool in summer and not so subject to frost in the winter." Close quote. The earliest reference to a basement kitchen found thus far is in the house of Jeremiah Van Rensselaer, constructed in 1658-59 in Beverwijk, the present site of Albany. Here's a cross-section of that house. During remodeling undertaken at that time, Van Rensselaer had a basement kitchen banked into the side of a hill, constructed under an older house frame. And that's, well, again, that's not going to work, but you can see the bottom of that, the illustration in the top. The bank foundation with cellar kitchen subsequently became a common type used throughout the Hudson Valley. Later examples of this form include the aforementioned Van Allen House, constructed in 1793-94 in Freesville, Rensselaer County, in which 7 enslaved servants worked in the basement kitchen and occupied an unfinished room on that floor as well as an additional room on the second floor. Sojourner Truth lived enslaved with her parents in Ulster County as the property of Charles Hardenberg, who inherited her family from his father in 1799. As a child, she recalled sleeping in the damp cellar, quote, on straw laid on loose floorboards, which in turn rested on an earthen floor. The floor was often wet, and water could be heard sloshing under the floorboards, close quote. The 4 or 5 servants who were enslaved by the Hardenbergs at this time all occupied one cellar room. I'll show you a couple of other examples in the region that have basement kitchens. We have here what was called the West Camp House, and the basement kitchen. You can see the large chimney there that heats the basement kitchen. The house is banked into the side of a hill, so that the family rooms are accessible at one end of the house at grade, and then the lower tier of rooms, at least one of which was occupied by enslaved people, are accessible from a different approach to the house. Here's a view in the basement kitchen there. In the Van Hosen House, a very similar situation, and in which it also has a basement kitchen, and the house is banked into the side of a hill to provide at-grade access at one level for family members and at a lower level for the enslaved. And a third example of that same type here, this in Pittstown, Rensselaer County. Sorry, this was the only available photo that I could show you of the basement kitchen, but that's the mantle there. You can see the house itself is also banked into a hill. The kitchen is in that lower level of the hill between that embankment and the barn addition. Abraham Tambrook enslaved 12 people in 1790 and had a large house constructed for his family in 1796-97 on the outskirts of Albany. This house contained a kitchen, service spaces, and food storage areas and cellars in the basement. A service stair connected the kitchen pantry to the dining room above and may have extended upward, where sleeping areas appear to have been located in the attic. Unfortunately, that floor of the house is entirely remodeled in the 1830s, and no trace of the original spatial arrangement at the attic level of the house has been identified. Yet a close investigation of finishes in the basement has allowed a reconstruction of the original room arrangement, I'm showing here, to be generated. The basement rooms had plastered walls and ceilings, and either stone or brick floors. A similar arrangement of board partitioned basement rooms, together with a cellar kitchen built to be occupied by enslaved servants, was constructed in Laurierville, Schoharie County for Lawrence Lawyer in 1810. I can show you quickly the, this is the basement kitchen. That room in the upper corner was used as a sleeping room for the enslaved people in the family. In the upper left is that small room is a pantry. And then the staircase there, which leads immediately from, it connects from the basement kitchen up to the dining room, which was immediately above the basement kitchen. So that served as a servant's passage. In constructing Cherry Hill, the farm residence of a branch of the Van Rensselaer family to the south of Albany in 1787, the carpenter's contract describes the house as needing to have, quote, 2 kitchens in the lower story, which is to be built with stone, close quote. This house still exists, but the restored basement kitchen is presently interpreted to the early 20th century. And the basement kitchens in that house are these 2 rooms. If you go there now, this is their orientation room. And this room they have, it was remodeled probably in the 1890s, and so it has a lot of beaded board finishes. And then there are pantries and storage spaces across the back. The practice of housing enslaved people in basement kitchens is corroborated by descriptions of several additional buildings that are no longer standing. One text describes the Johannes Overbau house in Greene County as, quote, a wooden building of 1 story with 2 rooms, with an addition of 1 room, which was used as a kitchen and was occupied by the slaves, close quote. The house occupied by David Abeal near present-day Catskill as early as 1768 had a, quote, wing or addition on the east end, about 40 feet long and 18 feet deep, with outer walls of limestone and sandstone. Beneath is a cellar kitchen where Lon and the other slaves used to spend their days, close quote. The use of basement kitchens and associated basement spaces as living quarters for enslaved servants was widespread enough in the 18th century to warrant a specialized term. Then recently constructed house of Reverend Schoonmaker in the town of Poughkeepsie, Dutchess County, was described in 1775 as having, quote, 2 cellars and a Negro kitchen with 2 rooms adjoining in the basement. Delancey's Mills in Westchester County were described in 1796 as, quote, a large and commodious dwelling house with a Negro kitchen, close quote. The context suggests that the kitchen was within the body of the house, the larger context of that article. That the term was contemporaneously used to describe a space that was inhabited by enslaved people is attested to by reference to a bed located in a, quote, Negro kitchen in Tennessee in 1837. Evidence of a variation of this form is found in the description of a modest house constructed about 1718 for William Van Orden in Greene County. The dwelling was described as, quote, partly a block or log house and partly of stone, and was built against the hill so that it was 2 stories high on the east side and 1 story high on the west side. The room on the first floor on the north side of the house was kitchen, bedroom, and sitting room all in one. The room on the same floor on the south side was occupied by the slaves. Behind these rooms, against the bank, was the cellar. The upper chambers were used as a granary. Close quote. This house was located on Lot 4 of the Loveridge patent bordering the Hudson River, but is now gone. The basement kitchen had been popular in urban areas from at least the mid-18th century in houses of pretension and continued to be a common feature of row houses constructed in urbanized areas along the Hudson River until at least the middle of the 19th century. An example of this is the house of Thomas Harding, a hatter, described in 1750 as, quote, 1 story and a half high, close quote, house in King Street, New York, having a, quote, cellar kitchen and a cellar under it, close quote. When reading descriptions of houses of this type, it is important to keep in mind that unless there is evidence supporting such an interpretation, it cannot be presumed that a basement kitchen was used by enslaved servants as part of their living quarters. All of which is to say, I mean, we can find a number of examples of basement kitchens, but you really do have to do, more work to identify whether or not there were enslaved people in the household, and if you can find any corroborating evidence that would support that. The second type of housing was called the wing kitchen. Philip Schuyler was the wealthiest man in Saratoga district of New York State in 1779. The house he constructed for himself as a summer retreat to replace that which had been burned by the British in 1777 still stands and is a large structure, 2 stories, with a basement kitchen. Now that part of the building is this, right here. So the house was initially built with a basement kitchen. Approximately 10 years later, Schuyler constructed a semi-detached kitchen wing, which you see in the foreground, with a large kitchen on the first floor and 4 sleeping rooms above. You can see 2 views of it, and you can see in the, this is the arrangement of the sleeping rooms. There's a kind of a narrow stair hall, very few windows, but 4 square rooms that all communicate with each other. Schuyler had 13 enslaved servants at this time, and so each of these rooms, which measure approximately 11 by 8 feet, may have been occupied by as many as 3 or 4 people. There are no windows in 2 of the rooms, and all 4 rooms relied upon rising heat from the kitchen fireplace below to keep them warm. While the kitchen and service wings of Schuyler's house in Albany do not survive, it is plausible that a similar arrangement existed there. So here, this is Schuyler's urban house, and there were these dependencies that were attached to the house. There's no evidence in the current basement of spaces that could have been occupied by enslaved people, and it seems unlikely, although possible, in the attic that there might have been spaces. Currently, both of those floors of the house are undivided volumes. Okay. The Jacob Houck House, formerly in the town of Florida, Montgomery County, offers yet another example of the same type. Houck constructed his house in the 1790s, possibly utilizing the frame of an earlier dwelling for the kitchen wing. Indications of the location of a steep staircase leading to the unfinished second floor spaces, the walls and underside of the roof were originally covered with boards, were identified during the process of disassembly of the house. So there's the house there. You see there's the attached kitchen wing with a gable into the street, and this is an interior view of it as it was being disassembled. The level of finish in the late 18th or early 19th century, you can get a sense of it from remaining plank walls here, but otherwise entirely just planked inside. In a variation of this form, a kitchen and servants' rooms are located in an attached wing, either at right angles or in line with the main body of the house. The Conan House in Claverick, constructed in 1766 with a kitchen within the body of the house, but soon altered, has a stone wing with just this arrangement. And the second floor room, sheathed in beaded boards, was likely a sleeping chamber for the 7 enslaved servants the family held in 1790. There's a view in the second floor room when we were measuring it a number of years ago. This form became one of the most frequently encountered types in New York State, eventually transforming into the upright and wing type vernacular house. Despite the frequency with which this form is encountered, it is the most poorly documented variation in terms of period accounts. An example of this type of living arrangement that may be recorded at the Pindar Farm in Sharon, Schoharie County. A mid-20th century account preserved oral history of the families having enslaved a married couple and that they occupied that portion of the house used in 1949 as the kitchen. In some cases, documentary evidence indicates the use of attics as dormitories for the enslaved. Such was the case in the modest house constructed in present-day Latham, Albany County for Madame de la Tour du Pin and her husband in 1795, which contained a room for the enslaved family which they had reunited. The recent French immigrants recorded that they had a carpenter create, quote, a room in the granary entirely to themselves, a comfort that they had not dared to hope for even in their wildest dreams. Now, the they they're referring to are their enslaved people. The granary referred to was apparently a loft in the roof rather than a separate structure unto itself. In the Hendrick Lott House in Brooklyn, the second floor of a lean-to addition dating to about 1800 includes 2 small rooms and a hall on the second floor. And these rooms are accessed via a hatch in a closet. The rooms are less than 4 feet high and do not have windows. The passage between the 2 rooms once communicated with one of the family bedrooms. So here, much like the Bound House, which it isn't really that far from, you can see here this was the kitchen wing, and then there's a lean-to. Now these lean-tos historically would be workspaces for enslaved people as well, and they typically served as laundries. They'd be immediately adjacent to the kitchens, and they would have, frequently they would have wells or water pumps in them or cisterns for supplies of water. The Lott family enslaved 12 people as servants in 1803. It is believed from evidence found by archaeologists that these rooms housed at least some of those people. And here we can see also, these are some archaeological finds that were taken out of that room in the second floor of the kitchen wing. Here is, on the site also, as you can see up there, was an out kitchen as well. In both of these examples, evidence is incomplete or inconclusive with respect to the remainder of the house and its occupation. That is, if enslaved people lived in other parts of the house as well, whether seasonally or on a full-time basis. In the aforementioned Van Allen house in DeFriesville, Rensselaer County, the attic space was used as a dormitory for enslaved servants and workspace and connected to a room on the second floor of the house and additional spaces in the basement. The attic was without lath or plaster, and the second floor space below was given only cursory finish. The walls of this latter space were comprised of the unfinished surfaces of the backs of the lath and plaster partitions of the adjacent rooms of the house occupied by the owner's family, and the whitewashed exterior walls which were packed with brick nogging. The room measured approximately 10 by 14 feet in size and was lit by a pair of windows on the south side and communicated with a space in the attic by a steep staircase. A less frequently encountered but formerly common type of housing for the enslaved that is mentioned in the historical record is the summer kitchen, occasionally also called a quote-unquote Negro kitchen. A few early examples of this building type remain in the region, and the extent to which they're used in the pre-1827 period is unknown. In many cases, structures which are identified today as summer kitchens are actually smokehouses. Those structures tend to be smaller in size than working kitchens, may or may not have a second floor room, and typically lack windows. As such, they fall outside this present talk. The earliest reference to summer kitchens is found in a building contract from 1641, which describes a detached kitchen that was to be constructed contemporaneously with a house. The building was described as, quote, a small kitchen, 20 feet long, 16 feet wide, covered with clapboards, and having an English chimney, close quote. Anne Grant described the seasonally occupied cottages on the Cellar farm at the flats in the town of Watervliet in Albany County in the mid-18th century as, quote, slight outer kitchens in which food was dressed for the family, close quote. These, she noted, were inhabited in the summer by the people enslaved by the Cellar family. Jephthah Sims similarly observed of the houses in Schoharie County that this building type was frequently associated with settlers of Dutch or German descent. He noted that, quote, frequently a Dutchman's house fronts its owner's barn instead of fronting a public highway. A small kitchen and an oven are often separately erected, both detached from the dwelling, close quote. The term summer kitchen is perhaps the most widespread of those used to describe separate kitchen structures, frequently with dormitories for enslaved servants above. Advertisements as far north as New Hampshire and throughout the Middle Atlantic states and the South use this term throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. The summer kitchen is typically associated with medium to large scale farms with a well-developed group of outbuildings. These structures were typically of wood frame construction and usually lacked interior finish, the back of the exterior sheathing and structural framing forming the interior unpainted surfaces. Summer kitchens were typically one room in size, with rare examples having second floor rooms or being of large enough size to be partitioned into smaller spaces. Although some of these structures may have had wood floors, or in rare instances brick or stone paved flooring, surviving examples typically have earthen floors, and this may have been the most common floor type. An advertisement for the sale of a farm in Bergen County, New Jersey in 1747 described, quote, a very good dwelling house, about 48 foot in length and 24 feet broad, with a large cellar kitchen, a dairy and store cellar all joined together, and an old storehouse, stable, and Negro's kitchen adjoining to each other, close quote. Another term for this type of structure is an out kitchen. This was used in the description of 1740, an estate near Newburgh in Orange County, which also included, quote, a good sash windowed house with a very large barn, a brew house, malting house with 2 cellars, all in good repair, close quote. Another contemporary out kitchen was described in 1748 as about 20 by 16 feet with a large hearth of 10 feet wide, close quote. There was a second kitchen and a dairy in the cellar of the main house on the property as well. Perhaps 100 examples of this type of structure survive in New York State, one of which was extant in the 1930s with the Caleb Smith slave house in Comax, Suffolk County, and was recorded by the Historic American Building Survey in the 1930s. Another is known to have stood near the Henrik Lott House in Kings County as late as the early 20th century. Its remains have been located during a recent archaeological dig. So we spoke about this small building there. Recently, archaeologists have excavated its foundation that still remains there on site. I'll just take an aside too. It's confusing when looking at the historic references to summer kitchens versus Negro houses. There's never any real clear differentiation, and the terms almost seem to be used interchangeably. I still have to do some more sorting out and thinking about, what might perhaps be considered a house at the time. Perhaps a good dividing line, which I haven't drawn here in the paper, would be to indicate if there were sleeping rooms, in that it kind of might have been more perceived or constituted a house properly. A summer kitchen survives at the Bronx House in Coxsackie, Greene County, but its superstructure was reconstructed in about 1840 and so does not represent the conditions during the time of slavery when the family of Leonard Bronk held 6 enslaved servants. This right here is the summer kitchen for that house complex. The roughly 16 by 17 foot 6 basement of the structure may reflect the size of the earlier structure, however. Another example survives today at the Maybe Farm in Rotterdam Junction, Schenectady County. Oral tradition has identified it as the slave house, quote unquote. This designation has recently come under some scrutiny, in part due to the known history of occupation of the building by a family member at a point in its history. By the 1780s, it was occupied by the mother-in-law of that generation of the family that was living in the house. So it's unclear if originally she just occupied the first floor room and the basement kitchen, and perhaps a loft above may have been occupied by enslaved people, or just how that worked out. We don't really know presently. Nonetheless, the basement kitchen of this building may have served as a dwelling space for one or more of the Mabie's family's 14 enslaved servants. You can see in the plans here, it's just one single room on each floor. The building was constructed in 1767 or soon afterward. That's been confirmed by dendrochronology, and measures approximately 17 feet by 22 feet 6 in plan. It contains a single room with fireplace in both the basement and the first floors. An unfinished room on the second floor is reached via a ladder stair. So this, oh, that one turned sideways. So that's the basement kitchen. You can see there it has a dirt floor. The walls and the ceiling were formerly whitewashed. That finish is mostly faded off. It was accessed via a basement stair. And then if we contrast that to the first floor living space, which has plastered walls, has some fine cabinetry in it, and had painted finishes. And then you can see finally that the second floor space, which is a little bit more modest again. Another early summer kitchen survives at the Vanderzee farm in the town of Queens, Albany County, in the vicinity of Ravenna. Here's a kind of a plan of the complex. A large number of buildings. Let's see, the main house is here. There is a small shop here, and this building was was what I believe was the summer kitchen in this case. A structure which was converted to a workshop in the second quarter of the 19th century bears indications of having been originally constructed as a kitchen. Here's that building there. The bent framed story and a half building measures approximately 19 by 20 feet, is accessed by a single door, and has a steep ladder stair leading to the second floor. Here's the ladder stair, and you can see the level of finish. There is no indication of plaster or any other finish on the interior except for areas of whitewash around what must have been the brick fireback of the jambless fireplace located on one of the shorter walls and opposite the entry. So here you can see the whitewash over what is an opening now that's occupied by a window, but that and that patched area of boards above is where the chimney formerly went up. So the chimney and fireplace have been removed. What would originally have been here is where this window is, would have been between these posts, would have been a panel of brick against which the cooking would have occurred. And so that was removed during the transformation of the building into a shop. This structure may date to as early as about 1765, when the farm was established by Cornelius and Agnete Vanderzee. Surviving examples of summer kitchens measure between 320 and 382 square feet in size, with an average living area of about 350 square feet. A few more examples will illustrate the type. I'll show you. Let's go through some here. Here's the Gibney House down in, I think it's Orange County, if I remember. Here's the summer kitchen here, and I think I have another, oops, that's interesting. Okay. Oh, it went black. Okay, so summer kitchen, outhouse, and that's their smokehouse. Smokehouses are more typically stone or brick because they have to resist a fire that's basically just being put in them, or coals being put in them. Here's another view of the summer kitchen. You get and then the inside of it, you can see here the finish is whitewash painted boards, the inside side of the back of the clapboards. And you can see the fireplace in the end wall. This is a really typical arrangement. Another example here, the Ulster outhouse in Lake Katrine in Ulster County. The house in the background, summer kitchen in the foreground. You can see, get a sense of their proximity to each other. Here's the other side of it, before it had been painted white more recently. And on the interior, you see here, not even whitewash on the inside, and the fireplace is kind of freestanding. It looks like it's in the middle of the room, but it isn't. It's against the back wall. These examples are all, I would say, pre-revolutionary. The Vrooman House in Schenectady, the only one of its type that I know of that still survives in an urban situation. Here you can see this very small summer kitchen. This one lacks a chimney now. You notice it's a single sloped roof, not unusual at one time. You can see here from the Van Bergen overmantel describing and illustrating a family farm formerly in Leeds. See here the house up there, and then an outbuilding there, which I close in here, which is of the same form as the Schenectady example, with a small chimney that you can see. This illustration dates to, I think, about the 1760s, 1770s as well. The structure of more specialized function, serving as a separate dwelling and workspace for enslaved people, appears to have been found only on estates large enough to be called plantations in this region. What may have been quite possibly a different building form, the quote-unquote Negro house, may not have included a kitchen in all instances, and in fact, this seems to have frequently been the case. These structures were typically associated with larger estates, and so were always rare. In one example from New Jersey, a large estate had both a Negro house and, quote, 2 tenements that will let or accommodate servants that have families, close quote. This suggests that the Negro house was not a self-sufficient building, but rather that it served as a dormitory and was not used for the housing of family groups because of the juxtaposition of another building that served that purpose in that ad. Another example from New Jersey seems to support this interpretation. The Richard Patterson House in Princeton was described in 1775 as a 2-story stone house measuring 53 by 30 feet and having both a separate kitchen measuring 22 by 16 feet and a Negro house. In a third example, the term Negro house is used in association with the description of, quote, a decent house, kitchen, and cellar, close quote, but is grouped with the outbuildings, including, quote, a New English barn and stable, close quote. The Henry Ludlow House in Orange County was described in 1741 as a new 50 by 32 feet stone house of 1.5 stories with a, quote, new stone kitchen adjoining of 20-foot square and a good outhouse of 18-foot square, close quote. The Big Bairn Estate on Babbena's Island near Hellgate was described in 1768 as having, quote, very neat and genteel dwelling house fronting the water with a large piazza. It has 3 rooms on a floor, a fireplace in each, a dairy room and storeroom with a Negro house adjoining it, close quote. The sale of the 450-acre plantation in William Chambers in Ulster County in 1742 included a Negro house and several likely Negroes, men, women, boys, and girls. The adjacent estate of John Breeze featured a 55 by 24 feet, 2-story house with a 10-foot wide lean-to and, quote, a separate stone building for servants, 24 feet long and 20 feet wide, close quote. One thing that unites all of the properties described as having a separate Negro house or servants' quarters is the presence of a large number of outbuildings in a substantial house. The last mentioned example also had a, quote, very large barn, stables, sheep house, hay barracks, and many other buildings necessary to a farm, close quote, on the property. It may be that the so-called slave house, formerly standing in Comac and discussed earlier, was an example of this type of structure. However, we have insufficient information to make a determination. Other examples which have an oral history of use by enslaved people include the Nicholas Veeder slave house at 205 Green Street in Schenectady, and a small house adjacent to the Wright Reed House in Somers, Westchester County. And in both cases, there are the buildings are both about between 20 and 25 feet on a side, and they also typically have either one room or in some cases have got a subdivision, as you see in the second floor here at the Wright Reed House, of a smaller chamber on the second floor. One structure called the Old Slave House at the Stormbecker Farm was standing south of the village of Schoharie in 1949. Quote, huts are said to have been erected by the wealthy farmers of the Schoharie Valley who were slaveholders during the 18th century. These are described as having been located on top of rock ledges behind the farmhouses. Quote, each owner having one or more of those slave huts. Each of these slave families had its own little garden patch, and until fairly recent times, it is said that a few of the oldest residents of Schoharie could remember when some of those slave huts were still standing, and when, in springtime, a few struggling sprays of asparagus could be seen working their feeble way up through the grassy sod, the final visible relics of slavery in the valley, close quote. Housing conditions appear from the above examples to have included minimal interior finishes. In summer kitchens, even the most modest methods for protection against drafts and providing a finished appearance, such as pasting newspapers or wallpaper under the walls, which was not uncommon among the poor, do not appear to have been used. This may be, however, due to the need to provide ventilation and release heat from the large fireplaces, which were a prominent part of such structures, and the small footprint of their plan. Plaster wall and ceiling finishes are virtually unknown in spaces occupied by the enslaved. Basement living spaces were typically finished with whitewash on walls and the ceilings, the latter of which were typically comprised of the exposed first floor structure and underside of the first floor floorboards. The designers of summer kitchens and basement kitchens were more likely to have been concerned with the efficient operation of the kitchen fireplace rather than the thermal comfort of the occupants of those spaces. These rooms and structures were likely to have been overly warm much of the year and their air quality poor. Other spaces occupied by the enslaved, such as attic rooms and rooms over kitchens, were typically heated only by radiant heat from the chimneys passing through these spaces or from whatever warmth traveled upward through the ceilings of the rooms below. In this one respect, these spaces were not unlike the majority of sleeping spaces of the period. Rural dwellings built previous to the adoption of coal-fueled stoves rarely had heat sources in their sleeping chambers, except for in the houses of the wealthy. A lack of plaster finish in the spaces occupied by the enslaved, however, meant that their living spaces were markedly more drafty and cold than those used by their enslavers. Only the largest of the extant wing kitchens were provided with a level of interior finish that begins to approximate the type of living conditions commonly considered to be sufficient by free persons of the period. But even in this, the level of interior finish provided for spaces occupied by the enslaved was notably lower status than that enjoyed by enslaving family members in the parts of the house that they occupied. Neil Larson has made a case for a correlation between enslaved people and the presence of a New World Dutch barn on a farmstead. In a limited survey that utilized the returns of the 1798 assessment rolls for the town of New Paltz in Ulster County, he found that over 83% of the 280 enslaved that were counted in the town of New Paltz in 1798 lived in farms that also had Dutch barns. Clearly, the Dutch barn was a conspicuous landmark in the African American experience. The late Peter Sinclair attempted to identify the same correlation between stove ownership in Ulster County and enslavers, but the results of his study are not entirely convincing. Although all the types of housing presented here were generated in response to the perceived need to segregate the enslaved from their enslavers, that end was accomplished by a variety of means. The various typological solutions appear to have been associated with the economic status of the owner. The wealthier families, as indicated either by number of enslaved servants they held, extent of real property, or a number of outbuildings indicated on their property, tended to opt for for the creation of a separate Negro house or a summer kitchen, and their estates frequently featured more than one kitchen. This structure type also appears, from current evidence, to have been limited to use by estate holders of English descent, at least within the Hudson Valley. This is not the case in the Schoharie Valley, however. The less well-off, but still wealthy farmers constructed summer kitchens or, in a later development, semi-detached kitchens, such as that at the Schuyler House in Schuylerville. The most modest form, the cellar kitchen type, in which the enslaved were housed within the body of the dwelling, was typically associated with families of Dutch or Germanic cultural heritage and was constructed in association with farms ranging across the broadest economic spectrum. Thus, the method chosen for the housing of the enslaved would have signaled to a contemporary observer not only the relative economic success of the enslaver's family, but in some cases their cultural affiliation as well. One can also infer from contemporary notices and surviving examples that the choices made in this regard were also driven by cultural affiliation. Preliminary analysis of surviving examples suggests that the more overt expression of slaveholding was valorized by wealthy English families, and that this was to a lesser degree the case on the part of families of Dutch cultural extraction. Thank you. I know that was a lot of information, but if anybody has any questions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wally.
Yeah.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions and answers. Anyone have a question? Well, also, for those of you following on the live stream, if you have a question, post it in the comments, and we will be monitoring that as well. So, any questions?
So, what percentage of basements with large hearths do you think were not associated with enslaved people? Like, is it very, very rare?
I would guess that the majority of those constructed before the Revolution probably were associated with enslavement. After the Revolution, I think there's a little bit more variation. And then certainly with gradual manumission by 1815, and certainly after 1827, any basement kitchen is intended either for indentured or free servants to use, or in smaller households, the family members.
So you had mentioned one example of enslaved people occupying the attic floor, the granary. And I was wondering whenabouts this started to happen, and if there were alterations done to the attic to accommodate the occupation of this space, like let's say the replacement of, ventilation openings with windows or the enlargement of windows.
Well, that's a good question. In New York State and in the New World Dutch Cultural Hearth, the area is occupied by people of Dutch descent in New Jersey, New York, Western Mass, and Vermont. In the 18th century, it would be very rare to encounter a second floor bedchamber. Almost always you see these houses that are 1.5 stories tall, with second floor spaces that are sometimes accessed via an enclosed stair. More often than not, it's an open stair, but that's really a later development. Earlier on, the finishes on the second floor, they were left almost entirely unfinished, and that space would have been used for food storage. It would have been a workspace, spinning wheels, looms, things like that would have been up there. Toward the middle decades of the 19th century, with the differentiation of room uses coming into wider fashion, these spaces were turned into bedchambers. And so there are actually very few houses of an early date that retain those spaces for us to kind of get a handle on what changes were made. I don't think I've ever seen any changes made to an attic space for the accommodation of enslaved people. There doesn't seem to be efforts made in that respect. Those changes all seem to date to the 1830s, 40s, 50s, after the period of slavery in New York. And so I would have to guess that, similar to the example I showed at the Van Allen house, that what we see there is probably the kind of experience that people had in the 18th century, where that space, we know from inventories of the house, what kinds of things were in those rooms, and it was spinning wheels and looms, so there were workspaces during certain parts of the year. They had feather mattresses there, which would have been what the enslaved people slept on in that space. And in that particular example, there was a very steep stair that connected to a second floor room, which is the only one that I know of, kind of an unusual arrangement where they were actually had a room on the same floor as the living spaces of the family, but it didn't have direct communication with any of the sleeping spaces. It had only a door into the main center hall of the house. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yes.
I started going off.
In the back.
Have you detected any distinction that in Palatine German folks in the area, that they fall more under the Dutch or the English practices?
They seem to follow closer to the Dutch practices, and there seems to be a more frequent use of banked foundations among the Palatine cultural group. Even when, I guess even in the Van Allen house, it's banked, but in a very different way. And the banked houses that you can associate with, say, there's here in Columbia County, there's the Stone Jug, which is a sweet little house that's got a severely banked foundation, right? But in many cases, you'll find in the Dutch-affiliated houses, much of the foundation is buried, and the end in which the kitchen is accessed may only be partly excavated. So that tends to be, it's used by both cultural groups, but with the Germanic groups, banking the foundation seems to be a lot more common, I would say. It's been my experience as far as examples I've seen. So.
Yeah, at the beginning of the talk, you spoke about that people had been remodeling or renovating just after the end of slavery to kind of hide the fact that they had slaves. And so I guess I have two questions from that. One is architectural, and what did they do to do that? And then the other one, do you have any comment on why that was the feeling and why it was so different than the end of slavery in the South?
Well, I'll talk about two examples. One, the Bound House that I talked about, right? And they were Quakers, and that was ostensibly not something that Quakers were supposed to be participating in. And yet in the Bound House, they are even to this day, the Bounds are held up as kind of, paragons of American freedom. And about 25 years ago, I was doing a structural report for the house and looking at it very thoroughly, and started collecting data on their slave ownership, and they were very happy at the time because the family had totally repressed that aspect of their history. I think they're beginning to own it more now because it is they have an historical society associated with it, and which is their board is populated by a lot of descendants. In that case, and in the case of the Lot House, they simply sealed off the rooms that were associated with enslavement. And so in the Lot House, people didn't even know initially that room was there. In some cases, you can't perceive them from the outside because they might not even have windows, these rooms. So they're more, and initially when rooms like this were initially kind of identified, they were associated immediately, right, with perhaps the Underground Railroad or things like that. But clearly they're 18th century rooms, they predate any aspect of that movement. And so those were a means by which they began their forgetting And another way, which was the the use of those spaces on the second floors, as bedroom spaces, which would entirely erase that earlier history too. And then, the advance of cooking technologies, and the introduction of cooking stoves in the early 19th century. Kitchens are moving to the first floor of houses, and so you don't need to use those spaces in the basement either. So.
I was struck by how far the summer kitchens are from the main house, at least in some of your illustrations. Have you run across anything that indicates how, on a practical level, you cook in one space, have a family of 12 in the main house, and are carrying stuff through the snow?
Good questions, and I've never found anything, but I can say this, that the kind of cranes that you see in the larger cooking fireplaces, in houses that have summer kitchens, you'll also typically find a crane in the dining room, and that's for keeping the food hot after its travel or reheating it once it's there. Yeah, so. Again, no evidence or information about the relative comfort of the people who are traveling that food back and forth, but.
Yeah, thank you. Could you explain in your final sentence about the valorization difference between the Dutch and the English with the valorization of, I guess, slave ownership?
Yeah, so, you can imagine a casual observer coming to a farmstead that's owned by a person of a family, an English family, and you have a large number of buildings, and you have separate, secondary houses on your property, things that are clearly domestic dwellings. That kind of goes to underlining your economic status and success. But to take the other tact and to kind of bury those functions within the body of the house hides it from casual view, right? So it's not immediately apparent that you have perhaps even the same number of enslaved people, living on your farmstead. So.
Other questions?
I'm sorry. Did you have something else?
No, I'm just musing. Have you ever seen the Dykeman farmhouse in northern Manhattan?
Yeah.
On Broadway?
Yep.
That has a basement kitchen with no internal staircase.
Yeah. And in some cases for these basement kitchens, you literally would have to go out by a bulkhead door. Like say at the Maybe farm, that was access that for them to get into the main house, they would have to go from the basement through the bulkhead door. They perhaps delivered some food to the mother-in-law who was living on the first floor of the building, but they would have to walk out to the opposite end of the stone house that's there to go into the house. It was not a priority to have internal communications. Some houses did, and that really kind of came in a lot more common use later. But in many of the earlier houses, the basement kitchens do not have an internal way to reach the first floor. So, not a concern of theirs. Yeah. So, it says a lot, right? So,
Thinking about the Dykeman house, did you have a chance to look at homes in Manhattan, not necessarily farmhouses, but other buildings, to see what kind of structures there were for housing enslaved people?
not specifically in Manhattan, except for the couple of ads that I referred to, but there is no urban housing in Manhattan that survives from that period that would reveal that. And there are some late 18th century houses in Manhattan, but they don't have those features. And there are some farmhouses, like the Dykeman farmhouse, but they also tend to not preserve their outbuildings, those farmsteads. For that kind of level of preservation, you have to kind of go further outside of New York City. But from what I've been able to find out from these ads, they appear to be, exactly an analogous situation. So.
How wealthy would a 1790 family need to be to have slaves, or did everybody have slaves?
Well, not everybody did, but it kind of, to have one enslaved person doesn't seem to have required a significant amount of wealth, because if you look at the 1790 census, which is our best and first kind of reference to slave ownership in New York State, there you can see there are many households that have a single enslaved person in their house. So it doesn't require that people be wealthy, although the poorest white people can't afford to enslave people. So.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of questions. One, for some of the larger, I guess, households where you mentioned that they had maybe up to 14 enslaved people, I was wondering if there was typically someone sort of in charge of those folks and where that person would live, if such a person existed. I was also curious if some of the structures that the enslaved people lived in were they locked in at night, or is that something that was done, or is there evidence of that in the structures?
So my office is located in that Van Allen house that I showed, and we have over the years been able to collect a substantial body of family papers, and because the head of the family was a congressman and in Philadelphia during the time the house was being built, and for like 4 or 5 years thereafter, we have an extensive internal family correspondence, both talking about the phased construction of the house, but also about managing the enslaved people in the house. And from that, and from other examples that have come across with the Tenbrook family, it's clear that there was a system of passes. There wasn't, people were not locked up, but they, in order to have mobility, they were required to have a pass and could be challenged to produce that pass. And the pass would say what they've been given permission to do, which could range from, there are instances where people talk about granting passes to visit family members 2 counties away, to attending a party, to delivering food to a friend, to doing all sorts of tasks, both personal and on behalf of their enslaving family. So in the Van Allen house, we know that to underscore the fact that they weren't kind of locked in at night is Evert, the son of John and Ann Van Allen, is reporting on the behavior of Gus, one of their enslaved people, and apparently he likes to go out and party with his friends, and they talk about him kind of coming back drunk yet again, and that this is a problem. He wonders what he needs to do and that kind of thing. Again, just only mentioning it to underline the fact that there was a freedom of mobility within a community without a pass, but outside of a community. And you have to imagine also, enslaved people didn't own the means of transportation, so they're walking, right, to wherever they're going, unless they have a pass and they've been given permission to use, say, the carriage owned by their master if it's a further away task. So there's a kind of a social policing that's happening all the time that keeps people in their place. So, yeah.
I wonder about the slave quarters at Lindenwold. Were they preserved or were they stylized out after Van Buren's presidency?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's a house that was built initially right in the 1780s or 90s, and it looked more like that Van Allen house. It's 5 bays wide, but it had 2 dependencies attached to the back. I don't know if it's been studied what that earlier use pattern was for the house, and if it has, I'm not familiar.
If I would just jump in there, because I spent a lot of time in Lindenwold. One of the projects that we actually are working on right now with Lindenwold is doing thermal imaging in the attic and some other work in the basement to sort of really determine where the enslaved people lived there. So that's actually an ongoing thing that we're working on over the next year.
Neat.
In the far back.
I have a question. I noticed 2 portraits in your presentation, and what do you know of photographs showing enslaved people, and who took the pictures, and is there any way that these pictures could be used to figure out who lived there?
Well, those 2 portraits, those I believe have been made available through the Lot House site, and I believe they're identified. There are sadly very few photographs that identify enslaved people in New York State. There are a few others. There's an enslaved gentleman whose name was Caesar, who there's a famous daguerreotype of him, and he was enslaved by the Van Rensselaer family. And in many cases, it's a fact that a lot of formerly enslaved people in New York and New Jersey didn't live into the period of photography. So there are just a few, and I showed the one picture, a painting of one of the Van Rensselaer children with one of their enslaved manservants, and that's a very rare survival. There might be, I think, one other picture that shows such an arrangement and relationship.
We have a couple of pictures in our archive of things that will be digitized and up on our website pretty soon of formerly enslaved people also. But you're right, there's not many pictures. Not many. Anyone? Yeah.
Sorry, I have one more question. What kind of archaeological finds would or have been found in areas where enslaved people live?
Okay, so that can be associated with enslaved African Americans, yeah. So at the Lot House, under the floorboards in that room that was discovered above the kitchen, there were some fragments of what's called colonelware, which is a kind of a rough ceramic, and which in the South is frequently encountered as having the fragments X's inscribed on them, which have been identified by many researchers as representing a cosmogram of African origin. And so one or more of those were found at the Lot House. Now, in other places, and this gets more into the whole subject of apotropaic magic, in which inkisi bags, which are kind of intended for as magical deposits, either for positive or potentially negative intentions. And they have been discovered in houses buried under floorboards. It can be really difficult to associate a cultural affiliation with a deposit that you're finding in those kind of contexts. But if you have a long history, or perhaps an exclusive history of that room being occupied by enslaved people, it gives you a better kind of foothold to start to interpret them that way. It's a whole broader subject. There is, that same cosmogram has been identified on the face of a fireplace mantle in the Germantown parsonage also. It's one of the things where kind of, and there were some ceramic fragments and glass fragments that were found under the hearth as well that may be affiliated with African American beliefs. Yeah.
I have one question from the folks watching online. Have you seen any evidence of Native American enslavement in any of your work?
Yes, and it's not that common, but it is referred to in the 18th century, and I can give you one example that's very definite, and that is, once again, the Bound family who enslaved a Native American, and we only know that because there is a receipt for lending him out to do work on another farm in the 17th century.
One more question? Anyone?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
To what extent, if at all, do we find like the current real estate market or proprietors of these homes like acknowledging the history or putting signage towards it or interested in your research, or what are we seeing?
You know, it varies, of course, right? And, you know, in some cases, we're still at a point where you frequently encounter stories that maybe are just not true, or either people, you know, kind of either downplaying that kind of history or emphasizing it, and in both cases, perhaps incorrectly. So we're kind of not at a spot yet in which I think information is readily available enough for people to make the kind of critical judgments to be able to kind of present them in something like like real estate ads or things like that. You know, it's I mean that information I would say is always suspect, I would guess. Yeah. So.
Thank you very much, Walter. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Good job. Thank you all again. Thank you all again for being here. I would ask that, since you all clearly are interested in this topic, if you have a house that you think may be a sign of enslavement or a space of enslavement, please feel free to reach out to us, because part of our work is trying to get information about the people who were enslaved in Columbia County, and where they lived and how they lived is always of great importance to us. So if you have one, and we can call up Wally and say, hey, come check it out with us. But that would be a great thing if you think that's something that you own.
Yeah, and I've continued to, you know, I've done field notes measuring a lot of summer kitchens, probably about 30 or 40 of them. Again, with like basement kitchens, it's kind of usually a little more amorphous, because you might only have the fireplace left, and the configuration of the basement may have changed radically over that time, so there's much less we can say about it, but yeah.
Right. Okay.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.